Sir Richard Scott's broken his silence to hit back at government complaints about his arms to Iraq inquiry. The accusation that the inquiry was unfair, he said, was ludicrous. Labour wants to reform the House of Lords. Hereditary peers would lose their right to vote. And thousands of homes in Wales are spending a third night in the snow without electricity. Good evening. As copies of the Scott report on the Arms for Iraq affair arrived on the desks of government ministers today, its author was defending the way he conducted the inquiry. Several former ministers, including Douglas Hurd and Lord Howe, have criticised the way they were treated. But today, Sir Richard Scott said the accusations that the inquiry was unfair were ludicrous. The report will be published next week. The Speaker of the House of Commons, Betty Boothroyd, has added her voice to those demanding that opposition leaders should be able to see advanced copies as well as government ministers.
Tonight at Westminster, the battle intensified over next week's publication of Sir Richard Scott's report on the Arms for Iraq scandal. Although the government appointed him, he and his conclusions are now viewed as threatening, potentially devastating. It's taken the judge more than 3 years to investigate and write his report. Ministers got their copies of the report today, but the government is being accused by Labour of news management. The opposition won't get the report until the very time of publication in 8 days. Sir Richard said the government had persuaded him to hand over advance copies today.
I would have preferred, other things being equal, that nobody should have had prior access to the report. That it should have been simply presented to Parliament and seen by anyone who was interested to see it for the first time then and there.
The House of Commons Speaker was approached separately by the inquiry team for independent advice. Tonight she responded with sympathy for the opposition's difficulties.
All I would say is that in my experience, the questioning on any statement is much better focused when some steps have been taken to enable opposition spokesmen and minority party spokesmen to have access some time in advance to the text of complicated reports, provided steps are taken to maintain confidentiality.
The Trade Secretary, Ian Lang, is said to be considering the issue. Tonight, too, the Labour leader spoke out for the first time about the Scott inquiry.
Lord Justice Scott has been strenuous in investigating the truth about a matter that goes to the heart of integrity in government. Without such a report, we would be unable to probe the issue in the way that it requires.
The Attorney General, Sir Nicholas Lyle, is one of those most under threat.
Do you think you could survive in government when you
I
resign?
think so, yes.
You're confident of that, even though this Scott report has been published or being published today. Have you seen it?
Yes, indeed. No, I haven't seen it yet, no, but I'm looking forward to seeing it.
As government concern mounted last year, Conservative heavyweights, led by the former Foreign Secretary Lord Howe, launched a campaign against the inquiry's procedures as being unfair. He accused Sir Richard of being detective, inquisitor, advocate and judge. Charges rejected today.
I think anybody who was actually at the oral hearing would not have regarded that handling of witnesses as being aggressive. How it was perceived by the witnesses themselves must depend upon the individual in question, but objectively speaking, I think it ludicrous to suppose that the questioning was aggressive.
I asked Sir Richard if his report was going to wreck the careers of some of those in government. He replied that what happened as a result of his report next week wasn't for him, but for others. Graham McLagan, BBC News.
And you can see more of that interview with Sir Richard Scott on Newsnight on BBC Two at 10:30. London and Dublin are at odds again tonight, this time over the Irish government's proposal for a Bosnian-style peace conference on Northern Ireland. The plan was announced by Ireland's Foreign Minister Dick Spring after he met the Northern Ireland Secretary today in Dublin. Ministers here described it as at best premature. The Ulster Unionist dismissed it as a circus.
The Irish Foreign Minister headed off for the United States this evening, the latest player of significance in the peace process, to try and secure the ear of Washington and President Clinton in particular. The two meet tomorrow. Dick Spring unveiled his proposal unexpectedly after the Anglo-Irish conference meeting, a resumption of one last week where he said he'd first put forward the idea, aimed at getting the Northern Ireland parties together.
We propose that they should all be invited to the same building. 2 days of intensive multilateral discussions to bring all the parties together in that format. This would be, be akin to the proximity talks that took place in Dayton, which are obviously very successful. And if they can work in a conflict such as that, I see no reason why we shouldn't develop them in the present situation that we're dealing with.
The idea is based on the talks at a US Air Force base in Dayton, Ohio, which produced the Bosnian peace deal. It was a closed area away from the media, and the delegations didn't at first have to meet each other, the Americans performing shuttle diplomacy without the air miles, as they called it, eventually pulling all sides together. But the Northern Ireland Political Development Minister in Belfast this afternoon gave the proposal a distinctly chilly reception.
In our view, in the light of the other very intensive discussions we're having with all the parties at the moment, this proposal is at best premature. And I do refer back to the joint communique, which suggests that the next substantive movement in this process will be a meeting of the two heads of government later this month.
That's carefully chosen diplomatic language which puts the Irish suggestion down as unrealistic. And the main unionist party was downright dismissive.
One actually is reluctant to get involved in a circus. Mr. Spring's proposing a circus. We would like something somewhat more serious and something much more practical.
But in a BBC interview, the Irish Prime Minister said the idea was plain common sense.
This is a practical proposal to deal with an immediate problem of 3 weeks, 8 parties, all needing to reach agreement on how they're going to talk to one another after 17 months of peace. We want to use those 3 weeks well. We suggest that everybody come together in the same building for 2 days and be available to talk to one another.
Now, neither the British idea for an elected body nor the Irish one for a brainstorming session are agreed. The formula for all-party talks by the end of the month remains as elusive as ever. And to get it, one of the governments is going to have to blink before the two prime ministers meet in a fortnight. Dennis Murray, BBC News, Dublin.
Freezing weather continued to cause problems around Britain today. Road, rail and airline travel was disrupted. More snow is expected tonight. Southwest Scotland was worst hit, with the largest snowfalls since the war. Most roads in Dumfries and Galloway remain impassable. In Wales, thousands of homes in Dyfed, Gwent and Mid Glamorgan were once again without electricity. Our correspondent Juliet Bremner reports from Wales on why the power is still off.
Many Swalec engineers working for South Wales Electricity haven't slept more than 4 hours a night during the past fortnight as they've battled to reconnect customers. But such heroics have won them scant praise. In the village of Tegrin in Dyfed, the Scorefields feel help should have come much sooner.
They came out Monday afternoon. We reported a wire down, gave them the grid reference and everything, and they were out literally in half an hour. But then they left about 10 minutes later without having done anything. They hadn't even moved the cable.
For David Williamson, trying to run a frozen food business, Swalec's slow repair rate is more catastrophic.
If we don't get it back pretty soon, we will be out of business tomorrow morning. That's how it is.
Swalec has robustly defended its bad weather record, saying no electricity company could have beaten the icy conditions affecting Wales. Customers don't agree, complaining that power cuts are bad enough, but they haven't even been able to get through to the telephone hotline to register their frustration. There might have been fewer complaints if people hadn't suffered power cuts lasting up to 6 days just a fortnight ago. Swalec rejects suggestions that this week's repeat performance can be blamed on privatisation.
The truth is that not only have we been able to spend more money because we could decide since privatisation, but we've been able to keep the same number of people on the ground doing the work and indeed introduce working methods which increase their efficiency.
Overhead power lines could be replaced by underground cables, but Swalec warns that bills would be massively inflated. Instead, they're relying on extra manpower from Midlands Electricity to help them out of the current crisis. Juliet Bremner, BBC News, Cardiff.
The government was urged tonight not to phase in pay rises for over 1 million public sector workers. Tomorrow, 5 independent review bodies will recommend rises for nurses, doctors and dentists, as well as teachers and senior civil servants. Unions say the award, which could be more than inflation, should be paid in full. The Labour leader, Tony Blair, has tonight set out his plans for major constitutional change with the radical shake-up of the House of Lords. He wants to scrap the voting rights of hereditary peers, insisting that most are there through birth, not merit. The Conservatives called it the politics of class envy. Our chief political correspondent John Sargent reports.
While the Tories talk of clear blue water between themselves and Tony Blair, the Labour leader has continued to lay out where he sees the big differences. And tonight, in his John Smith Memorial Lecture, he launched into a passionate and detailed attack on the makeup of the House of Lords. In terms of votes, those born to be peers counted far more than those who are made peers for life.
Are we really going to continue to have those laws passed by an upper chamber, a majority of whose members are not there by merit or election, but by birth? Perhaps because 300 years ago, one of their ancestors was the mistress of a monarch.
A very large proportion of the hereditary peers are Tories, and Mr. Blair points out it was only because of the Conservatives' built-in advantage that 8 years ago the Lords voted for the deeply unpopular poll tax. Labour plans first to abolish the voting rights of hereditary peers and only later to make the Lords an elected second chamber. Labour are hoping that forcing the Tories to defend the present arrangements will put the Conservative Party on the side of privilege. But the key point, according to the Tories, is that the present system works.
This would deprive Parliament of a range of experience that has brought to debates wisdom and knowledge which otherwise would be missing. It is quite simply the politics of class-driven envy. Their attitude is deeply cynical, immature, and damaging.
For Tony Blair, this is only one part of Labour's plans for constitutional reform. He also wants a Bill of Rights, changes in local government with elected mayors in the big cities, and, as soon as possible, a Welsh Assembly and a Scottish Parliament. The response from other opposition parties has been mixed.
Well, I do see movement here to recognising the unfairness of the existing system, and I think that is encouraging.
The problem with Tony Blair is not that he's going too far, but he's not going far enough. This is a moment for bold and radical change, not for proposals which are half-baked and half-hearted.
But if you take in all that Labour wants, as well as their promise of a referendum on proportional representation, it adds up to a packed programme of constitutional change. And for Mr. Blair, there could be a danger in his first Parliament of getting bogged down on matters which traditionally do not excite the electorate. John Sargent, BBC News, Westminster.
The Duchess of York says she'll fight any attempt by her former financial advisor, John Bryan, to claim 10% of earnings from her cartoon character, Budgie the Helicopter. The Duchess recently signed a deal in America said to be worth £3 million. She denies claims that Mr. Bryan was promised a share of her income. Another railway company in the process of privatisation is under investigation for financial irregularities. Union Railways, which is planning the Channel Tunnel rail link, is alleged to have used improper processes in buying equipment. Last weekend, the privatisation of the London to Southend line was postponed after allegations of ticket fraud. A Nepalese teenager brought to Britain 6 years ago by a millionaire businessman should be allowed to stay, according to an immigration tribunal. Richard Morley promised to look after Jay Khadka after his life was saved by Jay's father. The Home Secretary will make a final decision on the case. Emergency food supplies have reached the besieged capital of Afghanistan, Kabul, for the first time in 3 weeks. Rival armed factions have virtually destroyed the city with rocket and tank fire since the end of the Cold War brinkmanship between the Soviet Union and America left a power vacuum there. The Soviet army invaded in 1979 to support a puppet government, but it withdrew as political reform began in Moscow. Mujahideen rebels toppled the government in 1992, sparking civil war. Last year, the fundamentalist Taliban movement conquered much of the south and now has Kabul under siege.
The Red Cross chartered plane with its Bulgarian crew now tackles the torturous descent into Afghanistan 3 times a day, making the steep turns down from a peak half the height of Everest to bring relief to a city where some are now close to starvation. A blockade of the roads made the airlift imperative. The British Red Cross paid for it.
Things in Kabul this year are particularly bad. The winter's been very bad. Psychologically, I think last year they were expecting a peace. That obviously hasn't happened. And now with the blockade of the roads, there's very little food available. What is available is very expensive.
The food is distributed quickly by the Afghan Red Crescent to those they believe need it most. The sound of war is never far away, but the unusually cold winter which has caused such distress at least forced a halt to full-scale fighting. Without the right ration card, the hungry are turned away. Aid organisations can't hope to supply every need of Kabul from the air. Even scraps of coal don't go to waste. Fuel is as desperately needed as food. Transport is scarce. There's been no electricity for 4 years. And now these people who live in a landscape which looks as if the world has already ended face another spring offensive. The fundamentalist Taliban militia, who now control more than half of Afghanistan, only a year after they began their campaign, are poised to strike at Kabul again. Shah Mohammed, a commander in the government army, says his troops will defend Kabul to a man. The final battle for Kabul has often been predicted, but this spring both the government and the Taliban say they will fight the decisive struggle for the city. Meanwhile, the people who live here continue to live uncertain lives. David Loyne, BBC News, Kabul.
The Republican Pat Buchanan has upset the odds to win the first contest in the race for the White House. Party members in Louisiana gave him their backing. Buchanan, a former speechwriter for President Richard Nixon, built his campaign around hardline anti-abortion policies. It was an unexpected defeat for Senator Phil Gramm, who was expected to do well. The front-runners, Bob Dole and Steve Forbes, will join the race in Iowa. It's feared that nearly 200 German tourists died when a charter plane crashed into the Atlantic off the coast of the Dominican Republic. Dozens of bodies have already been recovered from the sea. Tonight, the German government said it was concerned it didn't have the correct paperwork for the Boeing 757's journey from Puerto Plata airport to Frankfurt. Most of the passengers were returning from holidays in the Caribbean.
The floating fragments of Flight 301 marked the point in the ocean where the jetliner crashed just minutes after taking off from Puerto Plata. Immediately, an air and sea search was mounted, but high winds have brought strong swells, which have hampered the rescue efforts. At its Miami Operations Center, the U.S. Coast Guard is coordinating the search.
79 bodies recovered. Okay.
The Coast Guard cutters have been joined by vessels from both the American and Dominican Republic navies. Several aircraft have also been scrambled, but with just a few hours daylight, everyone knows that time is limited. And even for those who may have survived the impact, there's the threat of sharks.
Well, there are sharks that are all over the warm waters of the Caribbean. I don't have any specific numbers of, the sharks that may be in that area, but sharks are common to the warm waters of the Caribbean. And in this high seas and with the rainy weather, it just hampers any search efforts that we have.
It's all desperate news for relatives of those who were on board the tourist flight. Many of them gathered at Frankfurt Airport for the latest information. They've been told that the plane that crashed was not the one which was originally to have made the trip. The Boeing 757 had a perfect safety record for 14 years. It first entered service in 1984. 693 now fly for 26 airlines. The first crash of a Boeing 757 was in Colombia in December last year. 163 people were killed. Veterans of the Coast Guard search and rescue teams insist there is still hope that there may be survivors from Flight 301, but they, like everyone else here, are baffled about why the aircraft seemed to be turning back to the airport and why it crashed. Even as the Coast Guard search continues, the investigation's already underway into what went wrong. Among the big problems is recovering the black box flight recorder. Given the depth of the water and the threat of sharks, that won't be an easy task. Jeremy Cook, BBC News, Miami.
Here, leading churchmen came away empty-handed tonight after trying to persuade the Heritage Secretary, Virginia Bottomley, to cap the weekly jackpot in the National Lottery. They told her it's promoting greed and hurting the poor. She told them it's all harmless fun.
The church leaders emerged after an hour spent trying to convince Mrs. Bottomley that they're not killjoys, but she's wrong in portraying the lottery as a harmless pastime.
I hope that when she reflects on what we've said, she will recognise that there is, along with the fun and the success stories and the good projects which we acknowledge are around, that along with that there is a darker side of some people being sucked into it and spending much more money than they should.
I certainly said I'd look very carefully and continue to keep the lottery under review. But we are the last country almost in the world to have a lottery. It's one of the most carefully regulated. And for example, the protection of players is fundamental to the work of Oflot, the regulator.
The government's case for being positive about the lottery rests on the fact that
sets up a friction force, as I've said, and that is what generates the heat. So it's simply like